Hi everyone. So this is Jacob, the host of Doers Within Emerging Markets, and I'm really honored and privileged to be to have Yoriko Morita. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Yoriko, yes.
Yoriko on the podcast. She has an incredible story, and I'll let her share her story and the company that she founded and what she works on. And I think it will be very, very helpful for her to share her story, but also kind of the background she has and how that is important to many of the entrepreneurs that in Africa, Asia, as well as Latin America, which is the broad base of our audience. So thank you so much and welcome on the podcast.
It's nice to be here.
So just to begin with, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and, about your company, Pattern Integrated?
Sure. So when I was a student, I studied physics, what interested me. And then I realized I really liked doing hands-on devices. So I have an undergraduate degree in physics. And then I started. I really liked it though. So I had a couple of internships where essentially my job was to zap things with lasers and see what came out. So I did that for 2 summers. And then I realized, so in physics, there's a lot of exploration of fundamental questions about science, about physics, about materials, for example. And that's what I was kind of getting into. I was going to do material science and material physics. Then I realized I really prefer the applications of those concepts. So making actual devices that people would use, that sort of thing. So even though I started off in graduate school in physics, I switched over to electrical engineering because what I wanted to do was to make devices. So I finished I have a Ph.D. in electrical engineering, focusing on liquid crystal devices and optical systems using liquid crystals. This was 20 years ago. So back then, the big thing was telecom. One of the things that happened was that during that process, I was exposed to the patenting process. So the device that I ended up making for the device on which my graduate thesis was based on a patent that a colleague had obtained. So my job as a graduate student was to get experimental results based on this patent. So I learned about how that patent came about, how that innovation came about, how they went through the patent process, those sorts of things. I was exposed to that and I realized, it just so happened that I took a class during graduate school as well. It was open to all engineering students about intellectual property. And the guy that taught the class, he was a former Silicon Valley big law guy who was involved in a lot of patent applications for some really big companies. He was teaching the class, and after the class, he pulled me aside and said, "You know what? You might be good at this. This might be something you might consider for a career, and I'll teach you how to do it." So that was about 25 years ago. And since then, so he hired me. He essentially took me on as an intern.
Wow.
Taught me the process. I did other things. I got into research. I got into some education for optics and photonics for a while. And then I kind of came back into patents. And I've been doing it ever since. So his focus was working with startup companies. He left big law because he was frustrated that he was too expensive for startup companies to afford him. So he started his own, a big problem. So he started his own firm to focus on working with startups. And this is a theme that's going to come up later. I started working with his firm, and then I went in-house at one of his clients and became in-house patent agent for a client that led to other in-house jobs. I went through what we call patent prosecution, which is essentially the process of obtaining patents. And then I kind of got more into the business of patents. So things like commercialization, licensing, those sorts of areas. I worked in that for a while and just came all the way around to the point where I was frustrated that I was at a point in my career that I could no longer work with startups anymore. And I'm from a generation where around the time, so I finished graduate school in 1999. And around that time, it was a startup boom. Everybody was getting money. A lot of my colleagues were starting companies. So I wanted to work with them. So in order to do that, I had to start my own firm, which eventually became Patents Integrated.
That's amazing. I think one thing that that most of the guests come on this podcast is just how fascinating the stories begin, and it is. I think one thing that is really fascinating, and I'll kind of follow up with other questions that that I have for you is. It's really amazing that sometimes the path you take is not really well planned, and it looks like it was an organic process that really got you to where you are now, and I really like that, because one thing that perhaps most of the audience have not done a deep dive into it, but when I look at the demographics, these are young people that they want to try something different, and sometimes planning your plans might not actually fit into what you ultimately do. And so it's just pretty refreshing to hear that kind of put down the stress level of some of our audience, having to figure out everything, the 10-year plan or 15-year plan. So thanks for sharing that. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. And by the way, switching from physics to electrical engineering is still really hard. It's more practical. But no, thank you so much. And that it kind of leads gives us a very good background about how you founded it. So one thing that for most of us, we don't really understand what intellectual property is. We don't know what patenting is and trademarking is. Can you just please give us a definition of that and the differences? Because I myself, I always get confused between what's IP versus patenting versus trademarking, if you can.
Sure. So intellectual property is essentially a asset class of intangible assets. So things like know-how, knowledge, innovation, branding, graphics that are unique to you. So all of these things fall under the category of intellectual property. So it's essentially anything that is unique that you created. And so the way that they are protected fall into 4 different categories. So one is patents, what you think of, that's probably the first category that you think of when you think intellectual property. So these are innovations, inventions, those sorts of ideas that are crystallized in a useful device or a process. And there are actually 3 different kinds of patents in the United States. There are utility patents. So that's the typical inventions and that sort of things that you think of. Another one is plant patents. So these are not naturally occurring plants. These are essentially engineered plants that can be protected as under the plant patent category. And then there are also design patents that protect the look and feel of a particular device. For example, the old home button on the Apple iPhone, that was protected under a lot of design patents, for example. So these are some famous, that's a famous example of a design patent.
Yep.
Now, so those are for innovations, things that you do or that are functional, that provide some kind of a utility and function.
Yep.
Another category is, as you mentioned, trademarks. So trademarks relate to things like phrases, graphics, names, logos. Those are things that define a particular brand or a particular company that is used by a particular company, and that company doesn't want other people copying it to create confusion in the marketplace. So that is another category of intellectual property that can be formally registered with the patent office in your country.
Yep.
So they protect things. A lot of companies that do a lot of branding,
Yes.
for example, different logos for different companies, a lot of phrases, company names, even all of those can be trademarked.
Definitely.
And then there are also copyrights that has to do more with the exact wording, or essentially a creative work
Yes.
that is essentially on a permanent medium. So it can be a painting, for example, or a book. A lot of these days, a lot of these creative works are actually digital media. So there are copyrights that can be associated with that as well. Essentially, it can be saved on a file. So those are items that are subject to copyrights.
Yes.
And the thing to keep in mind too is that trademarks and copyrights can be registered trademarks, registered copyrights. So essentially, you file paperwork with your home country's patent office, trademark office. Or they can also be informal trademarks and copyrights, where when you see with a logo or something with a company name, you see a superscript TM. TM. Yep. TM is a non-registered trademark where a company just goes out and says, you know what, we're going to call this our trademark. They're not as strong as a registered trademark. So when you register a trademark, it does go through an examination process to say, yep, that is unique. You get to own a monopoly on that. So there's when you see the circle R that is stronger than a TM. And it's a similar thing with copyrights. You can just put a circle C with the year of the copyright, as well as the owner's name. Maybe you might put all rights reserved, that sort of thing. So that doesn't necessarily have to be a registered copyright. You can just declare something copyrighted, which brings rights to you, the creator.
Yeah.
If you want to enforce it against somebody else, though, then you would want to register it.
Definitely.
And then there's actually a fourth category of intellectual property, which is called trade secret. And it is for any information that is valuable to the company, is secret, somehow kept secret, and then it is also protected so that it is under lock and key somehow. And trade secrets are kind of interesting because a lot of times with patents, trademarks, copyrights, these are published things. So when you file your invention as a patent application, all patent applications pretty much across the world publish in 18 months from the initial filing. That means that your inventions, everything related to your invention that gets published and put out into the world. Sometimes you might not want that out there in the world. So then that sort of information where if it's information that if someone buys your product and takes it apart, they would not be able to reverse engineer it. That sort of information may be kept. You may consider keeping it as a trade secret and protecting it that way. Definitely. So those are the sort of the formal categories of intellectual property.
I don't know how important that is, just to demystify, those terms, especially the TM and the C. I know most websites have the C on it, and what's the mean, the TM? But I think for our audience, especially those who just joined recently, we're talking about trademarks, patenting and copyright, and she went into trade secrets as well. This, I think, very important, how we think about our companies and whatever we're trying to build, right? And I think in mostly emerging markets, right, some of this has not been well formed, but I think eventually they'll catch up to that. Some of these laws and international patents and laws and all that, but you are the expert, so as we go through this episode, I'd definitely love to hear more about your perspective on this. So just as we segue into the next question, what should early stage entrepreneurs consider once they're thinking about intellectual property, which you said is one asset class, right? How should people be thinking about it, especially people who don't have any idea of what is? We're lucky to have you here on the podcast to talk about this, but how will how should an early stage entrepreneur be thinking about this?
So there are two primary reasons why clients come to me. One is they want to avoid getting sued as soon as they start selling their product.
Yes.
So that has to do with infringing on other people's intellectual property. And the other part, the second consideration, is they want to be able to protect their own product from being copied by others. Okay. So these are two things that are very important, I think, to every entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. These are things that it doesn't matter if you're in high tech or if you are building clothes, or if you're designing clothing or jewelry even. There are a lot of actually intellectual property considerations that go into that. But let's focus on those two things. So then one is you don't want to get sued, and the other one is you want to protect your own competitive market share or your own competitive advantage, yes, or your own market share. Mm-hmm. And these two things, from a legal perspective, can be taken care of using intellectual property. So one of the things that I do want to emphasize, though, is that regardless of whether you are just starting out or that you are an experienced entrepreneur, intellectual property considerations don't just stand on its own. Like, you can't just hire an IP attorney and just say, you guys take care of the IP part and I'll take care of the business. These are all very much intertwined, because intellectual property has a lot to do with how you develop your product, how you build your product, how you design your product, and how you protect your product. And that product development has a lot to do with what you're getting from your customers, what sort of feedback you're getting from your customers, where the investors want you to go, where you want your business to go, how you want to exit from your business, all of these things. So IP considerations, business considerations, and product development considerations all need to work together.
Yep.
So ultimately, these two questions of you don't want to get sued and you don't want somebody to copy you, they both have intellectual property concerns. And so they both have IP risks that you are addressing.
Exactly.
That all tie into how you develop your product and how you build your business. Exactly. So these are things that I think, these are the things that I would love for all entrepreneurs to think about before they even start putting any time and effort into your business idea. So one is that there are two big ways that IP can help you. So one is to help you avoid getting sued. Yeah. And then the other part is protecting your competitive advantage. Exactly. So that other people are not copying your product. Exactly. And just keep in mind that your business strategy need to take into consideration your product development strategy and IP strategy. They all need to work together.
Yep. That's very important. And just a shameless plug here. You have pattern integrated, you can definitely, hire them to kind of, to help you figure this out. And I think that's one of the things that we also try to bring here is to bring the resources that are important, that, people don't just get informed, but, I think kind of what you have said, Pattern Integrated is a place where, for everyone listening, is a place where you can go and get the information that you need. As from what you've heard so far, she really understands the ecosystem, and she can really help you, figure that out early on before you get into a position where you can get, you are faced with a lawsuit or something like that. So we're gonna put the link in the episode in the description below, and you can definitely reach out to our amazing guest here. So one thing that, maybe people might be curious about is what is the process of getting a pattern? I know it's more detailed and elaborate, I guess, but how does the process work, and how do you help your clients get that pattern or intellectual property that that they want to have in order to avoid being sued or for the competitive advantage?
Sure. Where I start with all of my clients is understanding what they want to do with their business and how IP can maybe help them achieve their goals.
Right.
So we always start with, well, how would, for example, what do you have? Mm-hmm. What product are you looking to build? Who is your market? Where are they? Because intellectual property protection is regional, so it's specific to each country. Where do your customers live? Where do you plan to sell your products? Where do you plan to manufacture your product? Where are your competitors, and where are they operating? So then we look at things like, say you are building a widget. Yep. Where are you going to build that widget? So are you going to be outsourcing or to a product development company to develop that product for you? Are you going to be manufacturing in your country or overseas? Where do you want what are the other companies in your market? Are they litigious? Do they sue each other? Mm-hmm. So these and do your investors care about intellectual property? Do your customers care? Can that serve as a competitive advantage for you if you can put patent pending or not? Do they care? Or there are certain technology areas, like some areas of software, the timeline of getting patent protection and the timeline of product development and the chances of you releasing a product and that product looking the same even 6 months later. Mm-hmm. That's very low, especially for technology companies or app companies. Yeah. So some of those times IP protection doesn't really make sense. So what are things that you can do in order to protect your competitive advantage given that sort of a marketplace? So these are all things that we talk about. And then if it does make sense to file for patent protection, or like if you are in a litigious industry that, for example, medical device is a good one, where there are really big companies that file for a lot of patents and you want to get in with them. Mm-hmm. You want to be acquired by one of these big companies, for example, then you want to be building an IP portfolio of your own so that it can plug right into fill a hole that is in this big company's portfolio, for example. So these are things that we do. So you can't, so once we decide IP protection, formal IP protection should be part of your company's arsenal, then you start going through the specific patent process, patent writing process, or copyright registration process, whatever, for your specific country.
So that's very helpful. And and to that, because you brought up regions and countries, how is, because I think the US has a different system for sure, as based on region. How is the US that process different from perhaps other parts of the world, or maybe the international bodies that, some people have to go through that, or some people, they're trying to build this competitive advantage in the US. Can you just please explain the difference, not necessarily the difference, but based on your experience, how is the US patenting process versus, other parts of the world?
There's been a lot more uniformity across the world these days. For example, the US, as well as pretty much most countries around the world, participated in what is called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, which is essentially you get to file one international patent application. And then within a certain amount of time, 30 or 31 months from the original filing, usually, you get to choose in which specific countries you want to file. So then the US is a part of the PCT. Pretty much every major country around the world is a part of the PCT. Okay. So pretty much all Asian countries, all African countries, so all of these. Okay. So the process of prosecuting patent applications in specific countries, patent applications or copyrights, trademarks, whatever, a lot of them, there is an international process that you can start. You can start with an international process and then go into the specific nationalizations. So we call that national stage filings. And a lot of that depends on where you're doing business. Is IP valued in your country? Where are you going to be? Will you be doing international business? Will your customers be abroad? Where are your customers located? For example, if you know that you are an American country, you are an American company that wants to be doing, say, clinical trials in Kenya, then what should you be doing? So it really depends on where you're going to be manufacturing your device. If you're going to be manufacturing in the United States, then definitely get US protection because you are a US company, and then maybe look into getting a patent application filed either specifically in Kenya there is an African regional IP application that you can file as well. So then you get a lot of countries in Africa covered. In case maybe that Kenya opportunity doesn't work out, so you want to go try, you want to run your clinical trials at a hospital in Ghana or something like that. So you can do things like that. But it's all, as far as yes, there are specific differences in the different countries, but the overall process is the same. You essentially put together, for patents, for example, you put together a patent application, you include a list of claims that define your invention, and then you essentially argue back and forth with your specific patent office. You will want to get help from a professional that has knowledge about that specific country. Like, for example, I am registered in the United States to work in front of the US Patent and Trademark Office. So you would want to work with me for US filings. I have partners that I rely on to take care of foreign filings outside of the United States.
That makes sense. That's really important. And I think people might reach out to you after this episode is published. But I think that's really important. And we're always, it never crosses the mind of some of the entrepreneurs I talk to, but I do think it really helps with the competitive advantage, especially those in Africa that are trying to build something that they envision can, change the dynamics of a certain industry or a specific work, specific work that they're working on. So I do think it's about time that people really realize that this is something I have to work on early on rather than later. So thanks for alluding to that.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that does come up for when I talk with folks outside, entrepreneurs outside of the United States, is that where so whereas you might actually, IP considerations can be considered earlier, like you're saying. It's something that every entrepreneur should keep in the back of their mind, but it doesn't always have to be an expensive process, or IP doesn't necessarily make sense for every company.
Yeah.
It's just that it's something that is hard to fix if you don't think about it right up front. Like, for example, something as basic as having incorporation documents or IP assignment documents, or even if you have a co-founder. Now, if you form a company with a friend, and say you have the original idea, but it's your friend, it's the co-founder that is actually implementing that idea into a product, then how do you assign the original idea to the company? How does your co-founder assign the implementation to the company? Or do you keep them separate? These are formal agreements that can lead to really bad things if you don't have them in place right up front.
That's a great example. I mean, that's a really good example, and I think some people might get aware of it. So in terms of, by the way, that example brought me to this big biological thing. I guess it was a lawsuit between the CRISPR-Cas9. I know there was a lady at California who discovered the CRISPR-Cas9 biological process, and there was this professor here at MIT in Boston that actually implemented it. And there was some back and forth in the biological science world about implementation versus discovery of the protein that and the mRNA that came out. So
yeah,
kind of way out of it, but I see see that.
It's certainly there. And that's just such an interesting situation too, because essentially there was a group of people that were working on the same idea at the same time at different places. And there was a race to the patent office. There are, look for some articles that talk about sort of like the patenting process that went went into that rivalry. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. That's amazing. So for going back to entrepreneurs, how should they be thinking about IP commercialization? I think you talked a little bit about this, right? But if you can add more to that.
Yeah. So one thing that has happened especially in the last 10 years or so, is that when you say IP commercialization, I'm assuming you're talking about essentially making money off of your IP in some way.
Yes.
So then if you are an operating company that is creating IP around the product that you are selling, that is one approach of IP commercialization. So you're essentially directly commercializing your intellectual property in your product. Another business model that has existed for a long time is the approach of actually innovating for the sake of innovation. For example, if you are just an ideas guy that comes up with a lot of improvements to existing products, for example, you can file for those patent applications without actually having created product around it. So you can have a portfolio of issued patents that you might be trying to either license to someone else or to sell to another company. That business model, that second one of innovating, creating creating IP assets and then selling that IP asset, that business model has become a lot more difficult, especially in the last 5-6 years, because of a lot of case law and a lot of litigation and litigation outcomes, as well as legislation in for especially in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So that's become very difficult. So then one of the things that I do encourage my clients to think about is, what is your exit strategy? So for example, I've seen an example. This is not my client. This is essentially a patent portfolio that I've been studying on behalf of a client. So this particular company that we've been studying has been filing patent applications from day one. So these are, even from right as they are starting the company, they've been filing patent applications left and right since the beginning. So then over the course of the past 4 or 5 years, this company has amassed quite an interesting IP portfolio. The problem is, looking at it from my client's perspective, these are not necessarily IP that's practical in product development. So then this just seem like, brainstorming ideas, all these things that you could do if you had no physical constraints and you had plenty of money. That sort of IP, but they're creating this big IP portfolio that looks really impressive. So then what we're speculating is that this particular company is probably looking at, so they're a VC funded company. So they have venture capital involved, which means that they're going to have to exit. So they've been around for 5 years. So, they're going to have to exit in the next few years in order to make the money back for the VC. So one of their strategy we're speculating is essentially amassing this IP portfolio that they're going to sell to somebody.
That's a very, very good illustration of kind of what I was thinking about. And
personally, I prefer to work with product companies that are actually making product and innovating around product. I have worked on the other side where I was trying to license essentially IP portfolios that someone else had created around another product, maybe that could be applicable to yet another product, that sort of thing. It's really hard. So if your expectation is that maybe you don't have the money for this particular innovation, that you'll be able to sell, you'll be able to get a patent on it and then sell that patent. So think about the timeline of how long that would take, as well as the amount of money that it'll take, and the amount of money that you may be able to raise for that, considering things like royalty rates and licensing agreements and that kind of things. Understand the process before you actually try to get into that.
Definitely. So just one question, and I think definitely love to have you in a webinar too, because I think there are a lot of people that would love to be part of this. But I think so far you have really help us learn a lot in the past 40 minutes. So just the last question on the industry, and we're going to go into some inspirational questions just for people to get a sense of how you're thinking about your work, and also just a few aspects of the patenting and copywriting and all that. But the last question on the industry is like, so as entrepreneurs are figuring this out, we have companies like yours that can really provide them great advice. Other things, what are the other stakeholders that they should be aware of? They should know that these are people that we should be paying attention to. You talked about, a bill that that can be passed. I'm kind of paraphrasing what you said, but how should people be thinking about it in terms of an ecosystem once they're trying to apply for a patent or trying to do a copyright as an early stage entrepreneur?
You should definitely be talking with other entrepreneurs in your same industry to see what sort of experience they've gone through. So for example, there's, I keep going back to this medical device example, just because IP is very important for medical devices. There are resources like meetups or that sort of meetings where the key people in your industry do come together. And those are good places to ask general questions about. So in your experience, do your investors care about the size of your IP portfolio? Or have you been sued by anybody else? Have you had any issues when you launched your product? That sort of thing. So definitely talk with others that are in your industry. If you know that you do want to move forward with IP protection, so after talking with various people, if you do decide that you want to move forward with a filing, a lot of patent offices actually have good resources for inventors. So for example, if the US Patent and Trademark Office actually has an inventor assistance center that they will take, you essentially can just call them and say, hey, I have this sort of an issue. I'm in this industry. Just talk in general, nothing confidential. And ask for, what are the things that I can do? What's your process? That sort of thing. So you can do that. So in fact, I just talked with somebody just recently that said she had when she was starting her business, one of the first things that she did was to call up the local US Patent and Trademark Office and say, hey, can you help me? Mm-hmm. And they actually helped her get through the process of getting filing and obtaining an issued patent for her.
Wow.
Whether or not that was the correct approach for her particular line of business, mm-hmm. So that the USPTO won't tell you anything about that. Yeah. But that's something to think about. Definitely. Ultimately, where you will, if you are serious about moving forward with IP protection, you will want to be talking with a professional.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Professional advice is key. That's helpful. Meetups are great. I think with the pandemic, it has been challenging, but I think the other online meetups as well. So
yeah, the nice thing about the online things though, so in the past year and a half or so, there have been a lot of industry related not necessarily meetups, like these conferences that would normally cost, hundreds or even thousands of dollars. They have really come down in price because you have to do it online.
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's this app that has come out. It's called Clubhouse. I don't know if you've heard of it. They have some really interesting conversations there with very highly notable people in the respective industries, and you just have access to them as a podcast film like this. Okay, that was really informational and very, very helpful. And I think our audience will appreciate that. So just a few more questions and we can kind of wrap up here. So what do you say to entrepreneurs who are intimidated by the whole process of getting a copyright or getting a patent? And as I've alluded to in the beginning, not everyone needs to have an IP, not everyone needs to have, a patent, perhaps, but, people that, you may have talked to, or they have talked to someone and say, hey, you need a patent. What advice can you give to them to say, don't be intimidated by the process, and this thing is, is important, and at the same time, it's not that, so what will you say to them, or him or
her? My advice will be that there are free resources. Mm-hmm. If you are audacious enough to want to become a startup entrepreneur, then you can figure it out. Mm. That there are, just make sure that you do read both the how to do something as well as how not to do something. Mm. It can be very expensive. There are some very basic mistakes that can be made, especially in formal IP filings, that can be avoided. If you avoid it at the beginning, it's a lot, it makes your path a lot smoother. Mm-hmm. If you make those mistakes early on, it can be very costly to fix. Mm-hmm. So there are tons of resources out there, whether it's whether it's some of these big law firms that have great resource repositories for startup companies. You can look up a lot of information. You can learn a lot about the patent process, the copyright registration process, all of those online or through podcasts or all sorts of things. There are resources out there. Just make sure that you do learn both sides of the equation, like why you should, how you should go through the process, as well as how you should not go through the process.
Exactly. From your experience, and maybe I'm just segueing here, do you think people have greater losses of not doing anything at all or going through the wrong process?
That's a good question. I think that because of my specialty, which is in complex software, complex technologies, complicated electronic systems, optical systems, that sort of things. Most times among my clients, they would be more harmed if they didn't do anything, if they didn't file for IP in the particular industries that my clients are involved in.
Yeah.
There are other industries. For example, I have a friend who's a software entrepreneur. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's created multiple companies. And I happened to talk to him just after he launched one of his projects. This was 6-7 years ago. Yeah, he's already moved on from that one. But this particular project, I just happened to be talking with him like right when he launched. And one of the things that he told me was that, I decided I am not going to file for IP, and I am not going to, even though I'm using other people's databases in order to pull information into my product, I am not going to go out and proactively get licenses from all of these companies, because that will cost my company more money than it will if these companies figure out I'm using their data and they come after me. So at that point, I'm happy to talk licenses. It's just that I am going to do things my way and then ask for forgiveness later. And he can get away with that because I think that particular company only existed for like a year. And so he got in, built his product, made his money, and then got out. So for that sort of a business model, IP filings aren't necessarily important for you.
Wow. So that's a very good insight. So now going into some soft landing questions here. What's the most fun thing about working with entrepreneurs and filing patents and advising them? What really makes you excited about the work you do?
So when I got out of the hands-on research, what interested me about hands-on research in the first place was the fact that I'm doing something really cool, something really new, something really novel. And then I switched gears into working with other people that are like that so that I can help them achieve their goals. So I think that working with people that are really smart, that are really passionate about what they're doing, that is the most fun thing about my job.
That's amazing. And also helping them to get to a point where they can have patented products. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think I just bring a different perspective. Like I said at the beginning, your business strategy. So a lot of entrepreneurs are really good at things like product development strategy, and or business strategy.
Exactly.
Let's look at your legal risks as well. So that's the perspective that I bring in, where I can say, I've been there. I've done my hands-on research too. I understand what you're doing. Let's add another perspective to that.
Exactly. And it's most of the time it can be a blind spot for most of them. And blind spots are really risky. So far in your work, what has been and I know this question might sound very cliche-ish, but like the what has been an advice that that's really helped you? I mean, perhaps you as a person, but also like how you look at entrepreneurship and the legal risk that comes with it through your work.
Sure. The thing about my job is that I consider myself kind of like a translator, interpreter. So I help product people talk and write in a way that can communicate with the legal people, like with the examiners at the patent office, that sort of thing. So I kind of consider myself a translator. And these are really smart people. So they, sometimes I deal with egos. Sometimes I deal with people that don't necessarily want to hear what I have to say. And this is something that someone told me probably 15, 20 years ago, was the phrase, what is heard is more important than what is said. And this is a leadership lesson as well. And I don't remember who said it. But I just remember that quote. It's probably out there somewhere that you can look it up. But that really resonated with me, because that is the quote that kind of got me more into negotiations and licensing discussions, even leadership and people management, as well as peer-to-peer. So there are things that, maybe you say things that you have things that you need to say, or you have a specific point that you need to make. You also need to understand how the person that you are talking to, how they are receiving what you are saying. So then you need to adjust what you are saying in order to make sure that that person that you're talking to hears the point that you are trying to make. In a way that makes sense to them.
That's this advice, I think it goes across not just in entrepreneurship, but in other industries and in life.
Life.
Yeah, I think life.
For sure.
That's cool. So just to kind of wrap it up here, and I think I'm incredibly honored and privileged to have you here. I do think the work you're doing is really important, and it's going to be much more relevant in emerging markets and growth economies. And just coming here on the podcast and really sharing all the knowledge you have and the experience you have, I think is invaluable, and I really appreciate the fact that you really took time out of your very, very busy schedule, I presume. I don't know exactly, but I presume that you're a very busy person. I'm truly grateful and honored. Before I will ask you to just, if you may, can have your contacts in the descriptions for people to reach out to you and potential clients as well. Speaking of yours, there was something I'd love to read that I think it came from your team, and it's just really interesting to say, in the world of intellectual property law, you have built alliances, bridged the gap between organizations, and negotiated contracts that have generated millions in revenue. You have maintained and commercialized patent portfolios and can talk technology with the best of them. And the really interesting part is, like, think of Mark Damon in any Born Identity films, and you get the picture. And I think that really stands out based on how you answer the questions and how you actually made this much more relatable to me, and hopefully the audience will get the same vibe. So will be okay for you to share your contacts with the audience, right?
Of course, yeah. You can. There's always the contact page, contact us page on my website, which is patentsintegrated.com.
Yes, which will be included in the description as well. Any last minute advice on just the big picture of IP patenting? Any last minute wisdom of the week, or wisdom?
I think just be ambitious. So I understand that if you are listening to this podcast, you may be in an emerging market that may not, you, for you, IP, it may not be the first thing on your mind. You may be more desperate to make sure that you get your products out and sold and all of those things. Be ambitious though, because IP is something that can help you launch internationally, launch abroad, launch at a bigger scale. So be ambitious, keep IP in mind, because it really can help you.
Awesome. Be ambitious. That's that's a tagline for September. Thank you so much again, Yoriko. We really appreciate your time, and pattern integrated, everything be included in the description. And thank you for listening again to this part, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Jacob.